I'm Will Beacham, ICIS Chemical Business Deputy Editor, and I'm here with Achim Steiner, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme, who's going to answer some questions about the chemical industry's progress towards the 2020 goal of safe production of chemicals and use of chemicals. So, Mr. Steiner, can you just tell me how well you think the industry is doing in progressing towards the global product strategy and self-policing?
Well, the global product strategy is certainly an active step in the right direction by the industry. One, because I think it acknowledges that there is a global dimension to products that are being put into the global marketplace today, and I think it is a good sign that that has been accepted. It's not just a corporate individual company path that has to be looked at, but really the product in its global context. Secondly, I think the acknowledgement that the strategy is needed to deal with different products is another potentially very important affirmation of what we have been saying and calling for a long time, that we need to take a life cycle approach. We need to look at the impact of these chemical substances from the production to the consumption point and even beyond that, where they either end up in stockpiles or in soils or in the hydrological cycle. However, I think the global product strategy from the perspective of a strategic approach towards international chemicals management is in essence a contribution to. I think it cannot be an end in itself, and it does not necessarily answer the question of how do we translate these findings perhaps of the industry into a set of concrete outcomes that address both public health and environmental safety issues, eventually probably even to the point where regulatory frameworks are needed in order to give expression to the scientific findings, but also the risk profiles associated with these products.
So you wouldn't expect the chemical sector itself to identify a chemical as being dangerous and then just agree to ban it itself? You don't think that's realistic?
No, on the contrary, I have in fact called upon the leaders in the chemical industry to assist us in moving much faster in identifying the high risk or chemicals of very high concern, as the European Union refers to them, in order to accelerate and facilitate either a much more deliberate management of these chemicals or indeed their phasing out or prohibition. Because so far it is the regulators who have to spend an extraordinary amount of time without necessarily having had access to lab results, the scientific research, the risk assessments that are necessary in order to identify those. I would like to see a much closer partnership between the industry and regulatory authorities, be they national, regional, or indeed in the global context, the United Nations framework conventions or conventions on particular chemicals or hazardous waste, to be seen as essentially a shortcut to taking substances out of the global marketplace that really are not considered to be safe.
Yeah.
And in here we are looking for cooperation, but I think it is probably asking too much of an individual company to simply declare a product unsafe and take it out of production. That's why we need an industry-wide approach, and we need an industry-wide approach in partnership with the international regulatory platforms such as the United Nations.
Okay, so in general terms, how well would you say the industry's doing in progressing towards the 2020 goal of safe production, use of chemicals?
Well, in terms of the goal, I think we are going far too slowly. I mean, on the contrary, at the moment what we're discovering is an ever greater set of risks and associated impacts that we may not even have been aware of in the past. So the challenge is growing at a time, partly because we have better knowledge, science is more precise, we have begun to understand also what can be the cocktail effects, so to speak, of multiple substances interacting with each other. The notion of dioxins, endocrine disruptors, the issue of DDT, I mean, many of these are examples of how essentially knowledge is at a point where we could act. But industry and also national authorities are not acting fast enough, and this is why the SciChem approach is, in my mind, such a positive signal, because it is actually saying, let us sit around the table, and despite very different viewpoints and perhaps also interests, we have to come to a common pathway, the strategic approach.
Okay, and finally, what's next for United Nations Environment Programme in terms of progressing towards 2020? You mentioned to me earlier something about new ways of financing, involving the industry perhaps.
I think it is one of our conclusions that when we look at the chemicals agenda as a whole today in the international community, one of the major challenges we face is that agreements are reached, and part of these agreements also involve financial and technological partnerships between industrialized and developing countries. But as we keep on agreeing and negotiating and signing off on certain agreements, be it the Stockholm-Rotterdam Conventions, Basel Convention. What is not materializing is the kind of financial support to developing nations to accelerate either the management, safer management, control, or phasing out of substances. And this is beginning to hamper our ability to act as a global community of nations. Therefore, in UNEP we have called a consultative group together that will look at the whole financing architecture and also the needs for the chemicals agenda without having to negotiate right now in order to provide a more realistic assessment of what is needed in the years ahead. That together with initiating the negotiations toward the Mercury Treaty and also bringing more synergy to these different instruments that we have negotiated over the last 10-15 years are priorities from UNEP's point of view in moving the chemicals agenda forward in partnership with the World Health Organization, with the Food and Agriculture Organization, initiatives such as REACH in Europe, but also with the industry itself and indeed stakeholders in civil society and the scientific community.
Can you give me any clues about the level of funding you'd be looking for from the industry?
Well, I certainly believe it will be significantly more than what is at the table right now, but if you look at the financing right now, it is so low that I think probably everybody would agree we need to do more, we need to find more resources. The question is, for what purpose, with what results, and with what accountabilities, and I think that is part of the challenge. But to put a figure on the table right now would be simply guesswork on my part.
Achim Steiner, thanks very much.
Thank you.